This is Knowledge Engineering with Semantic Web Technologies, lecture number 6, Knowledge Engineering. In this part of the lecture, part 4, we want to talk about metadata and semantic annotation. Okay, metadata. What do we need it for? Okay, so you see the situation here. If you are looking for something, so in a storage room, it's like in the web, of course, it's difficult to find something, especially also if you, for example, have put something in your storage room and then you want to find it again. So how do you do this usually? How do you find things again? Yeah, in the web, usually you do this via search engines. And the search engines, you know that they are looking into the content of the web documents, and they are in the content of the web documents looking for matches with keywords. So, and these kind of keywords are kind of metadata that are describing also the content of the document. So, therefore, we need metadata, data that describes our data, that describes our document, that we are able to retrieve it somehow. And this is the process of creation of metadata that we want to deal with today. Okay, so resources can be described via metadata. What are metadata? So I told you metadata is data that describes some kind of other data. So here in the informal definition in Wikipedia, you may find that metadata are data that contain information about other data. And of course, usually metadata are required to fulfill a specific purpose. So the purpose that you need the metadata for defines what kind of metadata you need. And of course, the metadata are required also to achieve a specific result. Like, for example, you want to find the document again. Therefore, you need, for example, a content-based description. So that would be metadata in that sense. We can also look at a more, let's say, specific description which comes from a standard textbook here from Durrell, 1985. You see here he considers metadata as structured encoded data, so it's structured at Durrell, and it's encoded in some way, and it should describe the characteristics of information-bearing entities. Okay, for that it's encoded in a specific way that it's machine readable, possibly, you know. And for the purpose, so he says the purpose of metadata is identification, retrieval, evaluation, and administration of the described entity. So these are 4 specific purposes for which you can use metadata. Okay, in the semantic web, of course, we have to broaden the scope a little bit, so we do not only look at structured data, for example. So therefore also the W3C defines what metadata are, and the W3C says metadata is machine understandable information about web resources or other things, which means metadata can be data about anything. And of course here, nice thing, it's machine understandable, and for that either you are using some kind of structured data where the semantic somewhere is fixed, or we are doing this with the help of semantic metadata, so with the help of semantic technologies that we have heard about. Okay, now we have to consider different kind of metadata. We have already heard about structured metadata. So structured metadata usually consists of name-value pairs. So for example, you have something defined as being an author, and you say the content of this field author then is, for example, Ernest Hemingway. So author is a type of string, therefore it's typed, of course, so typed resources, typed content. And the semantics, so the meaning of the structured metadata usually relies on some kind of common agreement between the people who use this metadata to describe their own objects and the people who use this metadata again to find, for example, this object or to do something with that object and that entity. And you can use, for example, standard vocabularies for annotating resources, also web resources with structured metadata. And for example, in the bibliographic domain, there is a vocabulary which is called Dublin Core, which is rather popular there. So for example, there you can give the title of a book or the author of a book. And for this, there exists a vocabulary which is called Dublin Core. And this can be, like the example here on the page, encoded within an HTML page, and you see here in the meta descriptions we have, for example, used this Dublin Core schema to give some bibliographic metadata about some resources. So If we have structured metadata, then there must also be something like unstructured metadata. So this is mostly text-based metadata. So here, the semantics usually is determined via natural language explanations, which are somehow given, so not necessarily via common agreement. And examples for this unstructured metadata are, for example, descriptions of objects or an abstract, so it means a summary of a document. And you see here an example. We have here Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species, and you see here, besides a small abstract, what this book is all about. So this is unstructured metadata, simply because it's given in complete natural language description. Okay, structured and unstructured metadata. What else can we distinguish? So we also have to consider the source of the metadata. So who authored the metadata? So here we distinguish between so-called authoritative metadata, which have been created by a trusted source, so an authoritative source. For example, the author of the original document, of the original described resource, of course, is an expert. He has authored the resource. Therefore, metadata which comes directly from the author is considered to be authoritative. On the other hand, it can also come from a trusted expert. So in the library, for example, trusted experts are librarians, of course, and they know how to describe books, how to think of keywords and stuff like that with which these books are described. So they are the metadata experts in the library. So if we have authoritative metadata, we also must have non-authoritative metadata. So what is that? Of course, here the source is much more unreliable. So it's created by a more or less unreliable source, like, for example, the users. So usually you do not know whether you can trust an arbitrary user. But non-authoritative metadata is used a lot today in the web, for example, if you look at collaborative annotations in social tagging systems, for example. So everybody there is tagging something. And for example, via mutual agreement, so annotator agreement, if you take into consideration that one, the terms on which the descriptions given by multiple users, if they somehow are the same, if they agree, then of course you also can put trust on that. So you see, the source always is connected with some kind of trust we put into that metadata. So we have authoritative and non-authoritative metadata. Okay, and of course we also have some kind of metadata which is dependent on semantic technology. So we also have to consider semantic metadata. And here, semantics of semantic metadata, of course, is explicitly and formally defined with the help of ontologies. And therefore it's some kind of machine understandable, which in our sense again means that it can be automatically read and interpreted correctly by a machine. So here you see a small example. For example, we consider here a book, and of course we say this book has an author, and the author is Ernest Hemingway, and we are using the vocabulary that comes from DBpedia, for example, and also an entity, Ernest Hemingway, which stems from DBpedia. This would be some kind of a semantic annotation of exactly this book you see here. So if you might wonder what this subject here in this RDF statement is, so I have simply put the ISBN number and created an own URI for exactly a specific book. Okay, so semantic metadata. They have the advantage that we can automatically understand, which means automatically interpret correctly the content of that kind of metadata. Therefore, for us, semantic metadata is, of course, the metadata of choice that we are dealing with. Okay, from metadata now we go to semantic annotation. What is that? So usually the term annotation, of course, implies to attach some kind of data to some other piece of data. So that's an annotation. So if I put metadata, or in that sense a kind of annotation, to another kind of document. So for example, I describe my book with, let's say, a title, who is the author, what is the content. So this, if I describe this and if I attach this kind of data to my original source, then this is kind of an annotation. And usually this annotation establishes a so-called typed relation between the annotated data and the annotating data. And of course, this relation might be of different quality. So you might give, for example, a comment, you might give an explanation, you might give a definition. So you see there are different kind of annotations possible in that sense. And usually you refer to, with annotation, to both. First, the process of annotating a document and also the result of the process, which means the annotation, so the data itself that is somehow put on or attached to some original data resource that you are trying to describe with the help of your metadata annotation that you have here. Okay, for this semantic annotation, of course, we can define a formal model. How would that look like? So this would be simply a tuple. So here it's a quadruple. We have 4 constituents of that tuple. So an annotation is a tuple consisting of A sub S, A sub P, A sub O, and A sub C. So what are these components? First, A sub S is the subject of the annotation, which is nothing else but the annotated data. Then also we have an object which of the annotation. This is A sub O, and this is the annotating data. So we consider here first the subject, which is the resource we want to describe, and the object, which is the annotation. And of course, between both, there is some kind of a predicate. So there is an annotation relation that defines the type of relationship between AS and AO. And again, we have AC, which in the end somehow defines the context exactly of that kind of annotation. So what is that? So let's have a look at an example. Here, for example, for our book, the subject, of course, is the book, which in my collection, for example, I characterize with here this ISBN number, which of course has to be in some namespace that I have defined locally for that document. So this would be the subject that is described with the data. The object, so my annotation, consists here of another entity, which is from DBpedia, and this would be Ernest Hemingway. And my annotation, Ernest Hemingway, is connected to my original resource via here the author relation. So this defines the type of relationship between both the original resource and, of course, the my original annotating data, my annotation. So what's the context now? The context gives information about everything which is related to that annotation. This, for example, means when has this annotation been performed and by whom has it been performed. So this is data that you use, for example, for a revision system where you see who has done what in which time, and also if you want to take care about provenance. Provenance, keep that in mind, is really important if you want to put trust on your data, if you want to put trust on your annotation. So it depends, where does it come from? Does it come from an authoritative source? Does it come from a user, somebody you do not know anything about? So provenance here really is an important issue to establish trust in your metadata. So this would be an example for that. So what kind of vocabularies are used for semantic annotation? One of the most prominent vocabularies here is the open annotation ontology. So this also is a W3C draft, and it exists since 2013. And as the definition document or the primer says, it specifies an interoperable framework for creating associations between related resources, annotations, using a methodology that conforms to the architecture of the World Wide Web. So therefore, it's also a World Wide Web W3C standard. Oh, it's not a standard up to now, it's only a draft, but it's used worldwide. Okay, so how does this work? You see it here in a schematic, in a picture. So you create an annotation. This is the yellow bubble. Usually you say of which type this annotation is. So here it's an open annotation. And then you have 2 parts. First of all, you have the body, and of course you have the target. And both of them, again, body and target, describe the annotation subject and the annotation object. So what else? So of course I can also annotate the context of that. So I can give provenance information for all of these constituents. I can give provenance information, for example, for the annotation itself. I can give it for the body. I can give it for the target. And what I can do here, for example, I can say who provided that annotation. So I have here a vocabulary property which is called annotated by. And I can also give the time which says annotated at. So there are several variants that you can look up in the standard. Let's have a look at an example. So here I have a standard text document which is called source text, and in that source text I want to annotate one string which is here Armstrong, and I want to annotate this string with the entity Neil Armstrong, which can come, for example, from DBpedia. So how do I do that? I create an annotation. So this is annotation 1. It's again the yellow bubble, and it's of type annotation. Then I say, okay, what's the body? What's the data with which I want to annotate? So that's the DBpedia resource Neil Armstrong. And then I have the target, so what is annotated with exactly the body. And here I define something, again, a concept which is called a specific resource. So, and this specific resource is a specific part of my entire document. So I have first to give a pointer to the entire resource. So this is here in has source. This is the source text. And then I give, or I provide a so-called selector with the property has selector. And this is kind of a text position selector that I can use. I have here also several possibilities to do that. And the text position selector, for example, determines the start of the annotation and the end of the annotation. So this means between character number 18 and character number 27, this part of the text in the document source.txt is annotated with the DBpedia resource Neil Armstrong. So this would be one of many possibilities how you can use, for example, this open annotation ontology to create an annotation for this text. So this is an example for text, but you can also, of course, use the open annotation ontology to annotate multimedia documents, like, for example, videos. So how does this work? So imagine, for example, we are considering here a video file. Video usually is a media which is dependent on time, so I must have some means to specify segments in time of that video. And this is possible via URI fragment identifier. You see this here in an example. So the fragment or media fragment identifier is a convention that can be used together with a URI. So as soon as this video is on the web, I can use the media fragment identifier, for example, to determine a specific segment in time of my video. And I can say from second X to second Y, I can define a segment. And I can do even more. Besides the segment, I can also define a fraction of or a specific part of the single video frame that I want to address, like you see here in that example. I can be besides the time fragment, I can also give a spatial fragment that I want to address and that I want to annotate. So this is important because this then again is the source that I want to annotate with the help of my open annotation ontology. And you see it here in the gray document. So here you see the open annotation ontology used in an RDFA annotation for an HTML document. You see here we are using a vocabulary, which is then the open annotation vocabulary. I define two prefixes for DC types, so this is part of the Dublin Core Standard. And for FOV, we know this is the friend of a friend vocabulary. And I say, okay, I define here an annotation. It's of type annotation. I give this annotation also a URI, which then will be content annotation 001. Okay, next thing I do is I define target and I define body. Again, the body will be, of course, the resource Neil Armstrong. And to do this, I use also a property that I use here. I use the hasBody property and say this one is a semantic tag. And I use the property FOV page for that and say, okay, this is FOV page Neil Armstrong. So the web page or a page containing information about that subject that is depicted here can be found in the DBpedia at the resource Neil Armstrong. And if you look at the target, so I have the property has target, and I say also the target is of type video, so that this is clear how the resource is to be interpreted. Then I look at the resource and I see here that in the URI I have a hashtag, which then gives me the idea that this must be some kind of a fragment identifier. And if I interpret then the parameters behind the fragment identifier, I see a time fragment from 20 to 30 seconds. And I see also a spatial segment, which defines first a coordinate of a point in X and Y coordinates in pixel, and then a width and a height for the part of the picture that is addressed here. So this would be an example of a semantic multimedia annotation. Okay, so now we know how to annotate resources, how to annotate text resources, how to annotate even multimedia resources. If I do this in a manual way, then of course it's easy. I can use exactly these templates. The point is, of course, there is so much information out there that it would be nice if we would have some means to provide also automated annotation. At least, let's say, for text documents, so because it will be really difficult to recognize Neil Armstrong in all the videos, for example, that are present at YouTube. So in text annotation, the process of identifying so-called named entities which can be connected to other resources which are available in a database or knowledge base like DBpedia, this process is called named entity resolution. And exactly about named entity resolution will be the next part in our lecture.